Hello, and thank you for joining us once again. We're going to continue with our survey of the books of the New Testament. There are 27 books in the New Testament, and they're organized into sections, just like a library. The first section is the book of the Gospels, and that's the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The second section is the section of history, and that contains one book, and that's called the Acts of the Apostles. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. In the Acts of the Apostles, we really focus in on the acts of two of the apostles, the Apostle Peter in the first half, and then the Apostle Paul in the second half. There's wonderful information there. It tells us about Christ's ascension into heaven. It tells us about the birth of the church. It tells us about the first persecutions the church had in Jerusalem, and then how from there the church spread throughout the known world. Acts was written by Luke, who was the author of the Gospel of Luke. Now, the Apostle Paul calls him the beloved physician, and Luke was a traveler with Paul. In fact, in the book of Acts, we get some wonderful first-person narratives of traveling in the first century. Apparently, historians value the book of Acts very highly, for it tells them a great deal about the trade routes, how the ships were organized, and how people just got about in the first century. But for us, when we want to look at the spiritual truths, the book of the Acts of the Apostles is filled with wonderful, wonderful truths that can help us grow in our faith and become more pleasing to God. Jesus himself gives us the outline of this book, and we read that in Acts 1 and verse 8, where he says, "And you shall be my witnesses both in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and even to the remotest part of the earth." You see, the apostles were told to remain on in Jerusalem until they received power from God. And we read about that in the second book of Acts, when they received the baptism of the Holy Spirit. The church grew then. On that day, there were 3,000 souls that were added to the church. And as the Lord, through the Holy Spirit, gave the apostles the power of miracles to confirm the words that they were saying, the numbers of the disciples grew and grew. They grew to such an extent that the Jewish officials became very jealous, and they arrested them and persecuted them and beat them. But that didn't cause the church to falter. No. Rather, it caused the church to grow. And in Acts chapter 8, we can see how the prophecy of Jesus was being fulfilled, where he said, "You'll be my witness in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and even the remotest part of the earth." And that's what we read about in Acts chapter 8, how the church spread to Judea and Samaria and then beyond. And then it continues to go on. We read about the first Gentiles entering the church in Acts chapter 10. We read about the work of the Apostle Paul and his missionary journeys, going through, first of all, the regions of Asia Minor, what we call Turkey today, and then moving over to Asia and Greece, visiting Athens and the great city of Corinth. And we read about how he continued to do the work of the Lord until he was arrested while in Jerusalem, finally by the Jewish authorities. He was in prison for 3 years in Judea until finally he was taken off to Rome, and he was able to proclaim the gospel in front of Caesar himself. The book of the Acts of the Apostles is very valuable for us today, for it tells us how the first century church functioned. And it gives us the pattern for how we can function as the church that Jesus Christ built as well. So I encourage you to read this book. You will gain greatly from it. Thank you very much for listening today. We look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye for now.